Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce, and my esteemed guest, not for the first time, Emerson Green, who has his own YouTube channel and blog and stuff, but we'll get to that in a second. This is just a preamble, right? If you are here for any kind of Ukraine war update, I'm not doing that. This is philosophy, and we're going to be talking about morality. Although, there's a lot to be said about the morality of war or the lack thereof. This is going to be a sort of meander through the long weeds, or maybe the beautiful flower bed of morality. I guess first, okay, let's introduce my guest. Like Emerson, hi, how are you? Welcome.
I'm good. Thank you for having me on again.
So just for those who don't know, Emerson has his own YouTube channel, which is, let me find it for you. Doobly-doobly-doo, here it is. So his YouTube channel is Counter Apologetics, Emerson Green. He is kind of a Warden Pod. He's traditionally had these two areas. One is more philosophy and theory of mind. The other is counter apologetics, does what it says.
It came out kind of like piecemeal. Like I started off just making counter apologetics, the little yellow square up there. It was just a podcast. And then eventually I thought maybe I should upload these things on YouTube, even though I didn't really like YouTube very much. And then after I made the YouTube channel, then I made this other podcast, Walden Pod, which is just about non-philosophy of religion stuff. But it all came about kind of piecemeal, so it's somewhat, disambiguated, I guess. But yeah, like at least half the podcast stuff ends up on the channel. So.
Oh, cool. And look, here I am. We had a talk about arguments against the existence of God and all sorts. So there's loads. Goodness me, there's some brilliant stuff. And actually, he's just recently had an objective morality discussion with Michael Humer, who's someone we'll probably mention tonight. And he's talked with him before as well. So anyway, that's that. Back to us. I guess the first thing to just set out before we do this discussion. What do we mean by morality in kind of definitional terms? So usually morality is split in philosophy into three sort of different areas. So first is descriptive morality, which is kind of like literally does what it says. It describes what people believe. So in this country, so many people believe that this is right, this is wrong, this is how people do their morality, this is what happens. That's really not so much of interest to like the ivory tower of philosophy. The second is normative or prescriptive morality, which is like what we should do. And those normally your kind of moral value systems, consequentialism or divine command theory and so on. And then there's this third element, which is there's an overlap, or maybe one depends on the other, meta-ethics. And meta-ethics is what is right and wrong, what does ought mean? Let's talk about, the really hardcore, philosophical nuts and bolts of ethical or moral value systems. And I will say that we'll probably use ethics and morality interchangeably. For me, there's not really any discernible difference between the two. Does that sound okay for you, setting out the groundwork?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would add something that the division that I've often heard made, what you call descriptive morality, I guess I would just call like moral psychology or moral sociology. But yeah, there's like meta ethics, which is sort of the most abstract. That's mostly what I'm interested in, at least like for our purposes today, with like regards to the moral argument for God. So meta ethics is morality objective, really abstract questions like that. And then normative ethics, that's where you get like utilitarianism and deontology and virtue ethics and sort of these theories of rightness and wrongness. And then there's like applied ethics, which is like, abortion and, gay marriage or, like anything that you might hear about in the news, I guess, or something like that.
Yeah, that's what I would see as descriptive ethics. Yeah.
No, because it's still about like what we should do. It's still prescriptive. Like, is abortion morally right or wrong? Is like an applied ethical question.
Oh, but there's kind of like but you're implying normative ethics there. I mean, we're arguing already, but we're applying normative ethics, which is say you should do this because of this is my moral value system. So yeah, it's the application of your normative ethics to society. Yeah, and what's great nowadays is we're starting to see applied ethics become more and more prevalent with things like self-driving cars having to be programmed with like ethical programming so that they hit this person and not this person because they know that this person is like a 10-year-old child and they have their life ahead of them, and this other person is a 90-year-old granny who's just about to die. So the car knows that, or whatever. The idea is that we are starting to see real application of morality in a way that maybe we wouldn't have seen so overtly 20 years ago.
Yeah, I'm resisting the urge to talk about how much I hate self-driving cars, but yeah, moving along.
Yeah, fair enough. So why? I mean, it's kind of obvious, but why do you think debates about morality are so important? What is it about morality?
Well, I mean, the reason that I wanted to talk about it, or that I've been talking about it more recently, is that I see this like massive disconnect between like apologetics and everyday discourse about objective morality and the meta-ethical literature. So I don't know many philosophers who think that like the standard moral argument for God is sound. Like, if God doesn't exist, then there are no objective morals. There are objective morals, so God exists, or something like that. I actually don't know many philosophers who accept that, including Christian philosophers, because the claim that you can't have objective morality without God is pretty much unsupportable. But most people, I mean, if I'm being blunt about it, I think they just don't have the attention span to like get into why that is. And it sort of depends which group you're talking about, but it seems like most people, atheists and theists alike, who believe that God is necessary for morality, they're just kind of unfamiliar with the like meta-ethical conceptual landscape. They just don't know what the options are. I've just come across that again and again. Like obviously there are exceptions, but
And
yeah,
I
it
guess
seems
there
like
are
that's the
differences
case.
between philosophers and apologists as well. So you'll see the moral argument trotted out incredibly commonly in debates, but that's not to say that those are techniques employed by actual philosophers of morality or moral philosophers. So yeah, they're the moral. Well, and we'll talk about the moral argument, but I guess this is probably a good time since you mentioned the term already. What do you understand by the term objective?
I mean that it's if something is objectively true, then it's true regardless of how you feel about it or your attitude towards it or whether you even know about it. So I think it's objectively true that the Earth is not 6,000 years old. And even if there was like a massive turn in public opinion and everyone suddenly believed that the Earth was 6,000 years old, it would still not be 6,000 years old, even though everyone thought it was. Um, so that would be something that's objectively true. And if something is subjectively true, then it depends on how people feel about it or what they think about it, or whether they know about it. So
So
I
you're
think,
loading in loads of axioms and contextual kind of framework to the claim that something is true.
yeah, like it depends on the subject in a really specific way. Like the truth of these proposition, it like constitutively depends on the reaction or the attitude or the feelings of the observer. So whether something is boring or riveting, or whether something is cool or uncool, or funny or unfunny, or like sexually attractive, like all those things depend on like they're constituted by the reactions or feelings or attitudes of observers. Like what it means for something to be riveting is that you are riveted by it. Like if you weren't riveted
Mm,
by it, then it wouldn't be riveting.
yeah.
That's but the thing about things that are subjectively true is that something can be true for you and not for me, so
Mm.
it's accurate to say that, you know, I found this boring and you found it not boring, and for you it really wasn't boring, and for me it really was boring. And it's not like one of us is correct or incorrect. It's like, oh, that was inaccurate of you to find that boring. Like that just doesn't make any sense because it's a subjective sort of truth. Whereas something that's objectively true, it wouldn't make any sense to say, the earth is 6,000 years old for you but not for me.
So does that mean to say you could have objective morality and subjective morality? They could coexist.
No, no, it's like something like I think that, torturing infants for fun is wrong. Oh,
Mm.
and I should actually mention that I should warn our listeners that, we'll probably casually be mentioning some horrific examples of immorality,
Yeah.
because you need example cases that are like really clear cut and
Yeah.
unambiguous. And, you need candidates that are, you need cases that are good candidates for things that are wrong, like regardless of context. And
Yeah.
for that, you've got to go to the extremes.
Yeah.
So I just I didn't want to hit someone out of left field with like torturing infants for the fun of it, with no hint that it was coming. So anyway,
Yeah.
fair warning, I
And
guess.
well, this is in. So sometimes there's a talk about reductio ad absurdum. So you reduce something to the most absurd thing. Some people say that, you know, that's a problem to use it. I use it all the time for the reason that, okay, let's see if the logic works, and I will take the most extreme example I can think of to see if you agree with the logic that's being used there. And if you agree with the logic being used there, okay, now let's trot back to this normal everyday thing that we were talking about. So if the logic didn't work there, how does it work for you over here? Because all we've done is change the context, you know, and so therefore it is useful. So there you go. I'm really interested in this, and you've already talked really about knowing things are true and not, and therefore, you know, we can get to talk about propositional sort of truth of moral claims or whatever. But before that, there's this idea that I see morality supervenes on, and that means depends upon. So what discussions of morality depend upon discussions of epistemology, which is how you know things are true or not, and what truth is, right? And what knowledge is. And then before that, it depends even more so on the ontology of abstract objects. So I'm really big on the fact that abstract objects is the most important debate to be having, full stop. And then once you've had that debate, then other things build up. I mean, not to like sound like a stuck record, I always trot out this book, which is why I'm atheist and not a theist, How to Do Knowledge, Meaning, and Morality in a Godless World. And here I talk about the stuff at the bottom is ontology, move on to epistemology, move on to teleology, and then end up with morality, natural theology and stuff in there as well. But the idea is you get to morality after doing all this stuff first. So just to let people understand what I mean by this, ontology of abstract objects is, say, something like loyalty, or even the idea of a chair, or who Emerson Green is, right? These ideas, I would argue, are conceptual. And if all humanity died, those ideas would die with us. There would be no such thing as loyalty, as Emerson Green, as a chair. There would just be the dead matter of the universe, right? What that means is, if morality is an abstract set of principles, then if we all died, morality would die with us. In other words, morality is a conceptually constructive set of ideas, and exists in our heads and is constructed individually. And without our concepts, our minds, our conceiving minds, you would have no morality. So my definition of objective is mind independent, right? And I would say morality is necessarily mind dependent because it's an abstract set of ideas. What would you have to say to any of that?
I think that I don't think that morality is kind of mind dependent in that way. Like, I think that we discover these truths in the same way that we discover mathematical truths. Like, I don't think that we construct the idea that 2 and 2 equal 4. Like, it's just true that, you know, 3 is greater than 1, and that, you know, 16 is less than 105. Like, we just found that out. We didn't really construct it. It doesn't really depend on our minds. Now, like, if we all went out of existence, maybe there would be no one to contemplate that truth, but it would still be true. Like, there's no possible world in which 16 is less than 1. You know, like, that's sort of a necessary truth that obtains in all possible worlds. And I think moral truths, at least really basic moral truths, are like that.
So, because I see maths as a language it's a map that we draw over reality to help us understand reality, but we shouldn't confuse the map with the terrain. Now, there are properties that are basic about morality, about reality, from which we derive our maps. But I think mathematics is this conceptual language. However, there are things like the law of non-contradiction. I think it's the laws of logic that I think, or what we call laws. I mean, the basic, principles of logic, or however you want to use language. I mean, we get to the problem of using language when we're talking about this stuff, but that is kind of, those are necessary principles, I guess, of the universe. And I guess the question would be whether morality is a necessary property of the universe in the same way that logic is, or is logic even, a conceptual pastime? And we're getting into like the real a priori, a posteriori conversation here. I don't know. Am I just going too far here?
Well, I mean, so you think that logical truths are like necessary? They're not constructed by human minds; they're discovered.
So this then, so the point of talking about this is like in order to talk about morality, we need to understand what we mean by truth uh, first. So and what our theory of truth is. So one theory of truth is a correspondence theory of truth, which is to say that my beliefs about the world or the universe correspond one to one with the universe, right? But the problem with that, I mean, that's broadly what I agree as a kind of rule of thumb. But the problem is that is an epistemological problem. So, how do I know what is true? So, for example, if I believe, your name is Emerson Green, right? And then it's like, okay, and maybe the world in this world, your name is Emerson Green, right? And I believe that, and then I've got this one-to-one correspondence. But the thing is, how do I know that? And what is so? Therefore, it depends on knowledge. It's like, am I a brain in a vat? Can I prove I'm not a brain in a vat? No, I can't. So, this Cartesian cogito ergo sum. What do I know indubitably? Well, only that I exist. So everything else is kind of probability. So I don't know 100% that your name is Emerson Green, uh, and therefore truths we can't necessarily know. Um, and so that then presents another problem. It's like we can have truths. So then you say, okay, well, there's pragmatic understanding of truth. Truths are things that you believe that if you believe that's true, and it's kind of true on the basis of it being useful that you believe it's true. And then all these other ideas you can pile into the whole pot of epistemology. And yeah, I don't know. I'm rambling,
I
but
mean, I think those are like independent questions. Like, what's the correct theory of truth and what's the correct epistemology? Like, how do we know about this? So, I think that the correspondence theory of truth could be true. Like, it's, whether or not something is true just depends on whether or not it corresponds to reality. And we could just be totally adrift when it comes to figuring out what's true. Like, those are both like compatible, so like they're just kind of independent questions about like, what's true, and then how do we figure out what's true, and further, like, how do we resolve disagreements about what's true? Like, you could have the correct theory of truth and then have no idea about how to resolve disputes. So like, yeah, I think they're kind of independent questions.
But then
So,
the idea is if there is a moral truth, if there are moral truths of the universe, then how do we know that we found them? So there's still an
yeah, no, and but
epistemological
that's like a
barrier.
separate question. Like, if there
Yeah,
are moral truths, like there could be moral truths, and then we just have a really hard time ascertaining them. Like,
yeah.
that's a possibility. Yeah, or we have a really hard time resolving ethical disagreements. But yeah, we have a hard time resolving scientific disagreements sometimes, or like
Mm.
disagreements about history. But that doesn't mean there's no fact of the matter about like what happened in history.
So there's so many rabbit holes. I'm to try not to jump down because we haven't even really got to object. So okay, how do you want to start this journey then into what you think objective morality is it worth talking about moral realism and moral anti-realism um, as a way to start this discussion?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that there are broadly like 5 options for you, like, and there are many, many like subdivisions.
Mm,
But like meta-ethically speaking, there are like 5 options. 2 of them are realist and 3 of them are anti-realist. And it comes down to, the responses you could have to propositions that assert a positive moral property, like the one I mentioned earlier about torturing an infant for fun is wrong. So there are essentially like 3 things that you could believe about that proposition. It's
hmm
either neither true nor false, it is false, or it is true. And then if you think it's true, I have some follow-up questions. That's where the other, the remaining positions come in. So that's why there are only 5 meta-ethical positions, because you take one of those statements, like torturing an infant for fun is wrong, or it's better to nurture an infant than to brutalize it, and you think that's neither true nor false, like, or you think that's false, like it's actually, if you say it's better to nurture an infant than to brutalize it, that's just untrue. Or you say it's true, and then I say, well, hang on, what do you mean when you say it's true? Well, you could mean,
that's why I was talking about how this conversation supervenes on like ideas of truth, and
yeah.
that's kind of why. But yeah, carry on.
Yeah, so I mean, you could think that it's like subjectively true, so that would still leave you in kind of an anti-realist camp, or you could think it's objectively true. And then if you think it's objectively true, then there's this further debate about reductionism versus non-reductionism, or naturalism versus non-naturalism. And this is just strictly in the case of metaethics. It doesn't really bear on like the broader conversation about metaphysical naturalism. But roughly, you think that evaluative or normative truths can be reduced to purely descriptive truths. Like maybe you think that rightness and wrongness, it's just a matter of the pain and pleasure of sentient beings. And that's all it is. So then you would be some kind of reductionist or naturalist. Or you think that some normative truths are kind of irreducible. Like you can't really explain moral truths in non-moral terms, which is what it would mean to reduce it. So those are the two realist options, naturalism or non-naturalism. But yeah, there are those first three anti-realist options, non-cognitivism / expressivism. So that would be the option of you're presented with this, claim about the world, torturing an infant for fun is wrong. And you say, that's not really a claim. That's more of like an expression of an emotion or maybe a command or something. But it's neither true nor false because it's not really a proposition. So that would be like the non-cognitivist or expressivist route. And then another anti-realist route would be the error theorist or nihilist route, which is to say that all moral statements are just false. And then there's the subjectivist route, like, oh no, moral statements are true, but they're just not objectively true. And then you move on farther to the realist camp finally. So those are roughly the five, really broad camps about, three of them are anti-realist. They deny the objectivity of morals. Two of them are realist.
So I guess you want to establish that you are a moral realist tonight, and that you are a moral realist of the naturalist bent. Yeah, and so therefore
More the non-naturalist bent. It doesn't have anything to do with the with like atheism or theism. I mean, notice that I didn't mention God one time.
No. Yeah. So okay. Would you want to define what you mean by naturalism then?
Yeah, naturalism, just moral naturalism. This is just in the context of metaethics. So the language game can be kind of confusing here, but doesn't have anything to do with atheism or theism or like anything like that. But in the context of metaethics, moral naturalists are people who think that there are objectively right and wrong answers to moral questions, and there are moral facts, but that these moral and evaluative facts are reducible to descriptive truths. And then the non-naturalists think that there are moral facts and they are irreducible. There are like irreducibly normative truths. You can't explain, moral truths without making reference to moral terms. So you can't explain morality in non-moral terms.
Yeah, and I guess I keep mentioning this. I wonder if this is sort of linked to Munchausen trilemma. So the idea that in order to ground anything or to explain anything, there are three ways of doing that. You can explain in a circle: A equals B, A equals a B, B equals a C, C equals A. So that's your circle. Or the infinite regress: A equals B equals C equals D. So maybe that's your reductionist one. You keep reducing it to other things, or you have an axiomatic truth, which is A equals B equals C. C, just because C, I can't derive that any further. It's just an axiom. Is that where you're going with that?
Sort of. I mean, yeah. I mean, the non-naturalist is going to think that like these moral claims, like there's nothing underneath them. They are kind of these like axiomatic, like foundational, basic starting points that can't be analyzed in more fundamental terms or anything like that. Like this just is true, and it's not like true in virtue of something else. And the naturalist is going to ground moral truths in something that they view as more solid. Like they're going to try to, like the moral naturalists, they think they have a more like generally empiricist kind of view, like they tend to have like, they want to reduce all moral claims to like descriptive claims, and they probably want to reduce a lot of other things to like physics or something like that.
So Sam Harris in a moral landscape.
I think that he's a moral naturalist. Some people disagree with me there, but I don't see how, because the two things that he repeats over and over again is that he thinks morality is objective, so he's a realist, and he thinks that morality is really just a question of the experiences of conscious creatures. Okay, well, when I say, the positively or negatively valenced experiences of sentient creatures, I'm not using any moral or evaluative terms there. Those are all purely descriptive terms. And he thinks that's what morality is. Like that's the correct theoretical description of right and wrong. So that's what moral naturalism is, so I don't see why people don't agree with me that he's a moral naturalist. But yeah, Sam Harris seems totally like a moral naturalist to me.
Okay, so how would you then establish that there is objective morality from your point of view?
Well, I mean, the main thing is that the implications of the non-realist positions are totally unacceptable, and the anti-realist positions are just unmotivated. Like, there's not really any good reason to accept them, and they have all these bizarre consequences. And it's like, why would you ever accept this view? Like, there's no really great argument for it, and the consequences are just bizarre. Like, they just seem inaccurate to me. Like, for instance, error theory is the view that all moral propositions are false. So it's like, if I say that the Holocaust was wrong, that's just untrue. And if I if I say that, like, harming an infant for fun is wrong, they're like, no, you are incorrect about that. Or if I say it's better to nurture an infant than to smash it against a wall, they say that's incorrect. You're wrong about that. And to me, that doesn't seem incorrect. That seems accurate. Like, it seems like just a fact that, one of those things is better than the other. So, like dropping a piece of paper on the ground, there's no, like, normative content to that. Like, there's nothing moral or immoral about just dropping a piece of paper on the ground. And if you're an error theorist, there's no difference between dropping a piece of paper on the ground and smashing an infant against the ground. And again, I'm just trying to figure out the way the world is here. And, like, does that seem true to you? That there's no difference between those two actions, between nurturing an infant and brutalizing one?
No, but I
Or
guess the difference is I think is there some kind of call that there could be a universal subjectivism, which is to say, so I go back
that's
to
just a
this.
different position, though.
Yeah, but sorry, just to explain why that's important there. So I again go back to this idea that how would morality exist if there was no sentient life on the or in the universe? Like, what's the location? It comes back to the abstract objects issue I have of the kind of location and the ontology of abstractor. And so I have that. So I disagree with you because I think
Well,
we
you don't have to
construct.
disagree with me, because I'm a non-naturalist, so I do think that moral claims are kind of like, moral ontology is kind of analogous to the ontology of, like, logical truths or something.
Yeah,
But naturalists don't think that. Naturalists are more like empirically minded. So
yeah,
if what you're saying could be a genuine concern, and it could just be an argument for moral naturalism.
yeah.
Like, you don't immediately have to go to anti-realism or subjectivism because of your concerns about, like, Platonism or abstracta. Like, you could just be a moral naturalist because they try to ground moral truths in, like, scientific truths.
Yeah, so I mean, but it's like what you mean by what is objective morality. So again goes like I could say, I can give you all the empirical. I guess when you say something like, so say an alien came down and said, "Oh, you shouldn't do Schwerblers," and you're like, "Well, okay, what Schwerblers?" And so the way you try and understand whether it's good or bad is to really kind of understand the consequences of what happens, and then you look at the empirical data as to like what that really means in terms of harm. And so therefore, it's really difficult to get away from morality being intertwined with an empirical understanding of the ramifications of any moral action. And so for me, like there is what we how we construct our moral value systems will be about the effects that we have on people. So for me, consequentialism is as a rule of thumb broadly what my moral value system is, even though I know it's broken at some level. Because I think I'm a bit of a moral skeptic, right? I think all moral value systems do not work. None of them work uh,
You mean
perfectly.
like utilitarianism and virtue ethics, like, none of those work perfectly?
Yeah, none of them work perfectly, and no one agrees on moral value system, and it hasn't done for 4,000 years or however long we've been doing moral philosophy.
Yeah,
And
no, I agree with that.
that probably tells us that maybe these things are insoluble because because they're conceptually constructed, and there literally is no right and wrong.
I don't know. I
Although
think that's a pretty bad argument, if I'm being honest. Like, I mean, there are things that we have total agreement on that are conceptually constructed. Like Harry
yeah,
Potter goes to Hogwarts. No one thinks that he goes to I don't know, Bloomingdale Elementary School. No, he goes to Hogwarts. But we constructed Harry Potter, and then conversely, there are things that are real, or there's a fact of the matter, and people don't agree. Like,
But
food
that
shot.
Harry Potter claim. Sorry, I'm interrupting. But that Harry Potter claim. Imagine that humans didn't evolve, right, and some other species evolved.
Mhm.
Like that wouldn't be a truth.
Right. But I thought you already acknowledged that you think logical truths are not like that.
Well, yeah. So then it comes back to like what are logical truths and how are they established in the universe, and what's the ontology of logic, and then what's a connection of that to these, like, is it wrong to, I mean, I think it's wrong to murder a baby, obviously I do, but
Yeah,
it's
everyone
just for
does.
me, but for me it's about the ontology of that idea, right? Which is to say that if all sentient creatures died, that it's wrong to murder a baby would have,
Well,
unless you,
there wouldn't be any babies.
well, yeah. So it's all wrapped up in the existence of us as like conceptual beings.
Well, I mean, I think that there's a difference between, human beings are gone, so now there's no one to like think about these things versus those things only exist because people are thinking about them.
Mm,
So I think there are things that exist and then we start thinking about them and they're not like brought into existence by us thinking about them. So I think that, logical truths and mathematical truths are like that. Like we didn't just make up it's of course it's useful, mathematical and logical language. Of course these things are useful, but the question is that all they are? Like are they just useful languages or are they useful because they're true? So I think that like logical truths and mathematical truths, all this language is very useful, of course, but it's more than that. Like it's useful because it's accurate. Like if it
mm,
wasn't true, it
mm.
might not be so useful. But I think that logical truths obtain in all possible worlds. Like there's no world in which um, certain logical truths don't obtain. And the same goes for mathematical truths, and the same goes for moral truths. Like I think that these things are not like perfectly analogous, but I think that as a non-naturalist, they are these kind of abstract, irreducibly normative truths that
But you'd have
couldn't
to reduce
possibly have
those
been
kind of truths
otherwise.
to some basic logical construction, because something like it's wrong to torture babies is very much contextually based in our society of what babies are and our species and that kind of
But what
understanding.
about more basic things like suffering is bad, with the proper
So
qualifications?
that's exactly where I was going with that, which is you have to kind of do some kind of reduction to to some basic logical principles. Well, I don't know if it is logical that suffering is bad, because can you imagine a scenario? We had this story. I don't know if I had this with you actually. The idea that if suffering was somehow good, or like or there are some beneficial outcomes to suffering.
Well, that's why I mentioned those qualifications is like, all things being equal to some extent, suffering is bad. And there's no world in which suffering is good. Like once you grasp what suffering means and,
Yeah.
what bad means, then it's this irreducibly normative truth that suffering is bad, just like it's this universal truth that 16 is greater than 1. And like there's no world in which 16 is less than 1, and there's no world in which it would be good to cause massive amounts of suffering for no reason. Like that's not possible. Like there's no world in which it would be good to cause massive amounts of suffering for no reason.
You do get some, well, the theistic world and Theodicy, that appears to be the basis of the
Well, that's not
entire.
for no reason. I mean, like
Yeah.
they say there's some kind of reason or some kind of, physical constraint that makes it that there has to be suffering for all these other good things. So that's not for no reason, at least in their
Oh,
mind.
right. Sorry, I missed the part that's suffering for no reason. Yeah,
Yeah.
yes. But the idea is you kind of boil it down to these basic components, and then all these other more complex sort of moral statements and propositions just necessarily derive from these basic principles at the bottom. Is that what you'd say?
Yeah, there are like foundational or more basic truths, and then there are further truths that are sort of based on this. So it's like, whether or not abortion is right or wrong or permissible or impermissible, like that's complicated. That's not really like a basic moral truth. Like,
Mm,
suffering is bad. It's based on many, many other things like empirical facts and like moral truths. But there's actually very little disagreement about the moral truths involved. It's mostly disagreement about the empirical facts, which is the case for a lot of moral disagreement. Like people just don't agree on what's actually going on,
mm.
just as like a descriptive matter. They don't actually disagree. It's not like, well, pro-choice people, they think it's cool to kill babies, and pro-life people think that that's bad. Like, no, everyone is against, like killing babies, like properly understood, but like pro-choice people are careful to, say, well, look, I think it's a fetus, it's different from a baby, it's insentient, like they have all these there are these empirical disagreements about, like, you know can the fetus feel pain or not. People don't agree on that, and pro-choice people tend to think that it can't, and pro-life people tend to think that it can. What a coincidence. But I mean, that's just a purely descriptive disagreement, right? Like, that's not a moral disagreement. They don't agree about whether or not the fetus can feel pain.
Yes. And talking about objectively true, objective truth. Thanks, Mitch Nazarone. Consider this donation to be objectively true. That's very kind of you.
I do. It obtains in all possible worlds. It couldn't have been otherwise.
Fair enough. I mean, is this objectively a good thing to do? How would you explain Mitch's donation to have objective moral value?
Oh, I'm not sure. I think his money could be better spent, like going to
No.
patreon.com/counter.
So I'm just gonna have to cut you out. Sorry, I don't like interrupting. I know I do too much, but just before no. So is there any other way? Oh no. Okay, Mitch, thank you. We won't use your example because this could go south. Thanks, Mitch. Really appreciate that. And if you have any questions or super chats, please get them in, and we'll do our very best to answer them. So I don't know if you've really established your ethical non-naturalism fully and fleshed it out. So sorry, because I keep jumping in. Go for it.
No, I welcome the pushback, because I never know what people's problems are with this view. So it's helpful, but yeah, I mean, I just think that it's not that I think the metaphysics of my view is like obvious or anything. Like, I'm still working that out, but I just think that there are certain things that I'm sure of, and then I kind of work from there. Like I there are certain things that I'm pretty sure of, and I don't want to give up those things. And then there are other things that I'm less sure of, and other things that I'm even less sure of. And I try to navigate this by being like, okay, I'm willing to get rid of the things that I'm least sure of, and that seems like rational to me. But anyway, like I said, I think that there are certain claims that seem true to me. Like, if I'm just trying to figure out the way the world is, yeah, some things seem right and other things seem wrong. And then when I contemplate the anti-realist positions, like the implications of it, and the implications of anti-realism are either that nothing is really right or wrong, either because moral claims are not truth apt, they're just expressions of motion or commands or something, or moral claims are all false, or it's true for me but not true for you, or something like that. The Holocaust was good for the Nazis but bad from our perspective. And when I think about the implications of these anti-realist views, they just kind of seem implausible to me. It's not just that they make me angry or I get emotional about them. It's no, they just seem inaccurate. I just don't think that's the way the world is. It's like some people telling me that, well, you think that 3 is greater than 2, but maybe in another society 2 would be greater than 3, or actually it's false that 3 is greater than 2, or it's neither true nor false that 3 is greater than 2. And then it's to me, that just seems wrong. It just seems inaccurate and false. It's not really about oh, it makes me so emotional, or I just can't accept the reality of my atheistic, nihilistic worldview or something. It's no, I'm literally just trying to figure out the way the world is, and it seems like some things are right and other things are wrong.
You're getting pushback. So Lance Independent, obviously you've had previous here, because he said there are more than 5 options. Emerson is mistaken about that. I've responded to him at length about this, and he's never offered any compelling kind of rebuttal.
So here's the argument. Once again, when someone offers a proposition like it's wrong to torture infants for fun, it's either neither true nor false, true or false. And then you can divide up. What do you mean by true? Subjectively true or objectively true? And by objectively true, do you think that these are irreducibly normative truths, or do you think that they're reducible to descriptive truths? So that's why I say there are 5 options. So what are the other options between true, false, or neither true nor false?
Yeah, and I saw Joe Smith of Majesty of Reason, who I've interviewed here myself. He hosted a debate with Michael Humer and someone else, can't remember his name, on objective morality, and he had a branching database, which pretty much sounds like your approach there, which is okay, yes or no, come down to here, yes or no. So I guess it depends what level you're talking about, is how many options there are, really. As you keep
I don't really
down.
know what Lance is talking about. We've gone back and forth about this a little bit, and it's I don't know if he's just combining different options and treating that as if it's a completely new option. But then he also seems to think that some of these descriptive claims about moral psychology are somehow relevant to metaethics, which they're not. And like some fact about like, well, what do people mean when they say this? And it's like that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the like ontology of moral claims or truths or what have you. And if someone makes a moral proposition, there are only so many options. It's not like true, false, neither true nor false. And then we can kind of elaborate on those. But that's why there are only a handful of options here.
So your claim. So to go back to your original claim. So you are okay. There's a moral proposition. You think it is objectively true. So it's true independent of whether humans exist. And
Or how anyone feels about it, or even if we know
yeah,
about it.
yeah. And I mean, is there anything more to say about that in terms of? I mean, does this require a Platonic realm where like
No.
abstract ideas exist or anything? And if not, how not?
Well, for moral naturalists, it definitely doesn't. For moral non-naturalists, it arguably does. But yeah, that's because you're claiming that there are these sort of abstract truths, like these things that obtain in all possible worlds, and it just sounds a lot like you're talking about, logical truths or mathematical truths. Like again, not perfectly analogous; they're just comparisons. But yeah, if you're a non-naturalist, then that is kind of what you're talking about. And if you're a naturalist, then no, you don't have to believe in any sort of like morally Platonic realm or anything like that. And I tend to lean non-naturalist, but I'm just a moral realist.
Okay, so how does this interplay? How does this intersect with religious believers and the moral argument?
Well, I mean, it kind of doesn't is the thing. Like if you kind of talk about, if you think about what we've been talking about, at no point does God enter into this discussion, and that's reflected in the metaethical literature which theists contribute to. It's not like it's just a club of atheists talking to each other, but like in the metaethical literature, God just doesn't come up very often. Like it's not like the apologetics literature, I guess. It's like what we're talking about is you know meta ethics. Like think about that branching structure that we brought up a moment ago. Let's take that first option of like moral claims that assign a positive moral property are neither true nor false. We can explore that and the evidence against that position, because there's totally convincing evidence against that position. Or moral subjectivism or error theory. And then like we can talk about naturalism versus non-naturalism, and at no point is like, oh, and by the way, there has to be like an unsurpassably great being of perfect love in order for any of this to make sense. Like it just doesn't factor in ever. It's just not relevant to it. And then when you talk about divine command theory, that's kind of a separate conversation, but divine command theory does fit into this structure that we're talking about. It's a form of subjectivism, because what's right and wrong constitutively depends on how God feels about things. Whatever language you want to use, it doesn't really matter. The point is, it depends on God, this observer. And if God doesn't exist, according to these people who make the moral argument, if there is no God, then there are no morals. So that means that morality constitutively depends on God. And the word for that in metaethics is like some form of subjectivism or
Yeah.
constructivism or something like that. So divine command theory is not like a way of getting objective morality.
But
It's not a way of getting objective morality.
would theists not do this though? Would theists, it becomes about the ontology of logic. So again, it goes to like the most basic ideas, which is, well, if God's responsible for logic, then God does underwrite, moral truths.
Yeah, I mean that also implies they have weird views about logic. Like and William Lane Craig is not a Platonist.
Mm.
He doesn't agree with me at all about like mathematical objects or abstracta, or like the necessary existence of moral truths. So like some theists are very against Platonism and abstract objects because they think they threaten God's sovereignty or something like that.
He's
But
got he picks and chooses his conceptualism. So he use it for. So I wrote a book on the Kalam cosmological argument, where for me conceptual nominalism is so the idea that abstract ideas don't exist out there, but they exist in here. Blah blah blah. That's a huge part of my case against the Kalam cosmological argument, and he rejects kind of conceptual nominalism that I use to set that out, but then, as you say, on the other hand, then uses it to talk about like mathematics and other things, and you're like, hang on. Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
sorry.
It's interesting. Like, you can figure out a lot about their worldview if you say, you know, if God didn't exist, then like would A still equal A or something like that? Or like if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. Like, would that be true whether or not God existed? You know, and like it's just interesting because some theists will say no, but most of them will say yes. But yeah, I mean, you have to have a broader conversation about how they think anything exists, and like if those things would stop being true, even if God didn't exist, then you kind of have to ask why. I guess they could have different ways of fleshing that out, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, there are issues with divine command theory, you know, that are like well known, but yeah, I just don't think that it's a good way of grounding objective morals, because it's not objective morals, at least not as it's understood in meta ethics. You know, it's not true regardless of how anyone feels about it or thinks about it, or regardless of whether or not we exist or something like that. You know, it's pretty straightforwardly not a form of, you know, moral objectivism to subscribe to divine command theory.
Since it's spam o'clock, I've already talked about this book, but actually my more recent book, 30 Arguments Against the Existence of God, Heaven, Hell, Satan, Divine Design, does take a pop at divine command theory. Both of those books do that. And I present, I think, 16 arguments against that. But a lot of them are epistemological arguments again, which is like, well, how do you know you've got the right God? How do you know you've got the right rules? How do you know you've interpreted them correctly? How do you know, and it's like, if you're not allowed to use moral reasoning. So for us atheists, right? Well, when we talk about why something's bad, we use moral reasoning. We say that's bad because rape is bad because this. Whereas the divine command theorists, who, just to let people know, divine command theory is the idea that what makes something right or wrong is that whether God commands it or not, or that God commands it, that's what makes it right. And you're like, well, then you're not allowed to defer to moral reasoning at all. Because if you can defer to moral reasoning, then that's what makes things right or wrong, and not God's commands. So they hate moral reasoning, but of course, if you can't defer to moral reasoning, then these are just arbitrary commands. And when you say, well, and they say, well, look, rape is bad, right? You agree? Now I can tell you why I think rape is bad. Okay, yeah. Okay, but you who adhere to the Bible, look, God has commanded it here and here, and then they say, no, God hasn't commanded it because God wouldn't command that. Okay, how do you know God wouldn't command that? And I love this argument. It's like, well, because rape is bad. So you know that rape is bad, irrespective of whether God commands it or not. So you're using either moral intuition or moral reasoning, like, which is therefore like grounding the morality of that claim that rape is bad. And so you can't tell me that God wouldn't command it without establishing that it's bad using moral reasoning.
Yeah.
Anyway.
No, I mean, it's true. Like, why does God issue those commands, or like, why is his nature the way it is? There are either moral reasons behind it, in which case, something like non-naturalism is probably true, because or like naturalism. But the point is, like, morality is real and objective, independent of God. Like, he's keying into these same reasons that we would key into. He's like, oh, I can tell you why rape is bad, and it's the same thing, you would say. So God knows about these things, being omniscient, but it's the same way. It's like, why does 2 and 2 equal 4 or something like that? Like, maybe there's something that makes it the case that that's true, but the point is, like, that's like rationally comprehensible, and it's not just because God commanded that 2 and 2 equal 4. And yeah, I think morals are the same way. And yeah, if there are moral reasons behind God's commands or his nature being the way it is, then morality is independent of God, and then atheists can help themselves to that morality if they so choose. Or if there are no moral reasons behind God's commands or his nature, then his moral commands are just totally morally arbitrary. Like, literally, and like, it doesn't make any sense to follow morally arbitrary commands. Like, if I just, anyway, it's arbitrary in like the deepest, most literal sense of arbitrary that you could get. Like, so either way, divine command theory is just an awful theory of of meta ethics. But yeah, I mean, really, the reason
it's
it's so
like
awful,
what you're talking about, it's a Euthyphro dilemma, or
Yeah.
throw dilemma, which is how do we is something good because God commands it, or is it good independent of God?
Yeah, and if I were a theist, by the way, and many theists take this option, they think, well, God commands it because it's good.
Mm.
It's like, yeah, I know. Like, I mean, I'm an atheist, so that means there are these. I'm an atheist, and I believe in objective morals, and you're a theist, and you actually do believe in objective morals. So yeah, God commands what He commands. There are moral reasons behind His commands.
Mm. But then, of course, the problem is for those theists is that then you can have morality without God, and it makes God a little bit redundant. Because let's face it, all arguments about God really devolve to things only matter if they have moral dimension. Do you know what I mean? Like, I was going to ask you this right at the beginning of the talk, which is like, why do we bother having arguments about morality? And are all philosophical arguments, do they almost all of them devolve to or defer to moral arguments? Because really, those are the ones that matter because they are the ones that have ramifications on human life, right? In meaningful ways. So if you like, as us atheists say, you can have morality without God, and then the theist says, well, no, you have to have God because God has to underwrite morality, because if God doesn't underwrite morality, then we don't really need God. Doesn't matter unless heaven and hell aside as like eternal. Like,
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't really see why it's I mean, yeah, God is kind of redundant in terms of like explaining morals, but he's also redundant in terms of explaining logical truths, but I don't really see why that's a problem for theists exactly. They're just like, yeah, these things couldn't have been otherwise. It's not really a problem for God that there are these necessary truths that obtain in all possible worlds and couldn't have been otherwise. It's like, yeah, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. That doesn't make God like redundant. It's just that's a necessary truth.
well, yeah, but I mean, I'm playing devil's advocate, but for the theist here, I mean, this then becomes all about like, God is not ultimately responsible for everything. So they're the logical truths, like logic exists outside of God, and therefore, by extension, if you're, as you're saying, that moral truths are supervenient on logical truths, then these exist outside of God, and then God is not ultimately responsible for everything. That would, I would assume, what the theist would say.
Yeah, I mean, it means that God is not like the ultimate source of literally everything, I guess. So yeah, I guess some might have a problem with that, but they just gotta. I mean, look, there are reasonable theists and unreasonable theists, and I think that at some point, it's just not good to reason like, oh, what would be the most respectful to God? Well, if I say He's not like the ultimate source of all things, that feels something about that feels wrong or like disrespectful. It's like, do you think that's a good way to like reason about the world? Like, even from your own theistic perspective, like that just it seems like theists just shouldn't be thinking like that. It seems so obviously like a bad way of approaching,
But I mean,
how do we
I
figure out
presume,
what's real? Like
do you
that's a
think that
horrible
that's
way.
what William Lane Craig does? Because William Lane
Yes.
Craig uses the moral argument.
Oh
Um,
yeah, definitely. It's also
so
why
what?
he hates abstract objects.
Yeah, yeah. So why, if you debated William Lane Craig now, how would you what how would you show the moral argument to be false?
I would just show the first premise to be false, basically. Like I would just flesh out an alternative, like in quote unquote atheistic, but really it's not atheistic. It's just kind of independent of God. Like it could be the thing that I believe about morality, like my metaethical view could be true whether or not God exists. Like it really does not bear on it. So I would just flesh out my non-naturalism or ethical intuitionism a little bit. And yeah, I would just be like, here's my metaethical view. It's coherent, it's intelligible, it's a logical possibility at the very least. So premise one is false. That's
Yeah.
it. It's not like it's so bizarre. It's like saying I don't know, like, well, if God didn't exist, there would be no like Pop Tarts, but Pop Tarts exist, so God exists. It's like, what on earth justifies the first premise? Like,
Because it's
there's no
something. This is
reason to
about the
think that.
mattering of morality. This is the power that morality has over people. It's like the most important thing for theology. for people. Do you think that's what's going on here?
I think I just have slightly different intuitions than other people, because people seem to like just automatically think there's some kind of connection between like objective morality and God, and they think that if you're an atheist and you're a nihilist, then you're just being honest. And like if you're an atheist and not a nihilist, then you're kind of being evasive and dishonest with yourself and like disingenuous. And none of them can explain why the fuck that is, because it doesn't make any sense. Like you can flesh out these meta-ethical theories that make no reference to God. And again, theists have contributed to these. This is like there's such a huge disconnect between like apologetics and like the meta-ethical literature here. But sorry, I actually forgot what the question was. I
Rants. I don't. I was just impressed with your just ranting. Well, in a good way. Well, talking about moral, you've kind of made hint there to moral intuition, and you've spoken
sorry. I admit there's some kind of connection there that I just don't see, and it happens in other areas as well. Like theists and atheists alike seem to agree that there's some kind of connection between God's existence and objective morality. And I think it's just wrong in every possible way, because divine command theory is, false and like not very helpful in establishing objective morality. And I think that there are plausible non-theistic meta-ethical theories of like, moral realism that could be true whether or not God exists. So it's like God doesn't help, and also there are these other theories that, work with or without God. So the whole idea that like you can't have objective morality without God is wrong in like every conceivable way. But there are also other claims like about the world where people seem to sense this connection that I don't get. Like I'm a non-physicalist, as you know, and a lot of people think that atheism and physicalism are just like almost synonymous.
Do you want to
Like,
explain what physicalism is here for listeners?
Yeah, it's just the idea that there are, there's one world, the physical world, and specifically it's, in the context of philosophy of mind. So they think that everything about consciousness is reducible to or identical with physical truths. So mental truths, they reduce to physical truths. So you can sort of form this intelligible bridge one way or another between purely quantitative truths about your brain, and like somehow you can characterize your brain in such a way that like you will capture truths about mental states as well. Like your mental states are really nothing but they're nothing over and above the physical processes, and physical processes are nothing over and above they have no properties other than those ascribed to them by physical science, specifically physics. So they have this like very simple ontology, like there's only the physical world. The physical world only has the attributes ascribed to it by physics and physical science more generally. And like, I just don't think that can accommodate certain truths about mental states, like that they're qualitative. We have these first person subjective experiences. And I just don't think that, I think that like physical stuff is just too like austere to account for our mental lives, at least all of them, every part of our mental lives. So anyway, I'm not a materialist or a physicalist, I'm a non-physicalist, but I'm also an atheist. And I personally don't see much of a connection between those things either. But people seem to intuitively feel that like, well, if dualism is true or idealism is true or some sort of non-physicalism, then that somehow like dramatically raises the probability of theism if it doesn't just prove theism.
Because there's a supernatural realm, and suddenly, ooh,
it's not supernatural though. It's
I know,
just not physical,
yeah. But I'm sort of playing the intuition of the other people. I mean, you are, if I correct me if I'm wrong, you are what's known as a panpsychist. So the idea that there are mental elements as basic properties throughout the universe.
It's like the intrinsic nature of the physical is mental in character. So it's a lot like physicalism. It just tries to solve the hard problem.
Yeah.
But I sort of divide my credences between three forms of non-physicalism. The first is panpsychism, the second is dualism, and the third is Mysterianism. But yeah, I don't grant exactly equal credence to those three positions, but those are the only three that I personally think are like plausible.
Which my mate Rob's just come on, and he's an idealist. So we are going off topic here, but Rob, I'm sure, would love to, because he takes a pop at panpsychism quite often as an idealist. So he believes that everything, and he's a theist as well. So he believes that everything is one effectively, and there is only mentation and mental stuff, and all the physical stuff is effectively some kind of illusion. But we won't go down that route now, because.
No, the only point I was making is people draw connections between these things, and I don't really see the connection myself. Like, I think an atheist could be a non-physicalist, they could believe in libertarian free will, they could be a moral realist, they could even believe in like a necessary being. And you don't have to be a theist to believe any of these things. I think it's just kind of contingent sociological connections that make us associate theism with all these other things and atheism with all these things, these contrary positions. But I don't think there's like some kind of essential logical connection between atheism and moral nihilism, or like atheism and non-physicalism or anything like that.
So what are your views on, and I bring this in because the Michael Humer that we've mentioned a couple of times, he talks about phenomenal conservatism, and he believes in objective morality, as I presume he's a non-theist. What are your views on phenomenal conservatism? A, what is it, to explain to the viewers, and B, is it what does it have to say about intuitions and things seeming in terms of morality?
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, we've talked about phenomenal conservatism before. You've written about it before in the context of like skeptical theism and stuff. But yeah, it's just the idea that if something seems to you to be the case and there are no defeaters for that seeming, then you are justified in taking things as they appear. So a lot of people sort of grab the wrong end of the stick, and they think that you can't really believe anything unless you have some kind of like evidence for it, or like scientific evidence, or there's got to be some argument for anything that you think. And the point of phenomenal conservatism is that you are justified, you are rational in taking things as they seem to you in the absence of defeaters. So you don't need an argument to trust your senses. You need an argument to not trust your senses. If it seems to you that there's a table in front of you, you don't need an argument that there's a table in front of you. It just seems to you that there's a table in front of you, and there is no compelling argument that this table is an illusion. So you're justified, you're rational in believing tentatively that there's a table in front of you. So these are all like defeasible beliefs. They can be defeated by arguments and, by like evidence. But the point is, your starting point, a rational starting point, is to just take things as they appear. Like it's actually, first of all, it's self-defeating to say otherwise, to say that like, we should not trust the way things seem to us. But yeah, I mean, of course, we should trust the way things seem to us. What else should we do? Trust the way things do. We should take what seems to us, invert it, and then, okay, whatever seems wrong to me, I'm going to start off believing that. Like, no, of course you should start off believing what seems right to you, and then you move from there using arguments and evidence and so forth. But the point is your starting point, especially in these areas of like really foundational truths, like I keep mentioning some of these basic mathematical things, like 3 is greater than 2. You'd be hard pressed to justify that outside of like intuition. So an intuition is just an intellectual seeming. It's just the way something seems to you kind of rationally or intellectually. So if I say 3 is greater than 2, you think about the concept of 3, what that means, and then you think about 2, and then it's just obvious to you that 3 is greater than 2. There's no argument for it. There's no like scientific evidence. We didn't observe it through like a microscope or something. It's just we ascertain it through rational intuition. We reflect on it once we understand the things involved. And then, it's just clear that 3 is greater than 2. So I think there's a similar thing going on with moral truths, where when I say, suffering is bad, with the proper qualifications there, that once we understand, the relevant terms, it's just kind of obvious, and if people say, well, what's your scientific evidence that suffering is bad? Oh, what's your argument that suffering is bad? It's like, well, I don't need an argument that suffering is bad. You need an argument that it's not bad. Because it just seems to everybody, moral anti-realists included, that some things are right and other things are wrong, and certain things are bad and other things are good. And, if we just take these things at face value, yeah, we're kind of at this default position of moral realism.
So, we're talking about suffering. So, utilitarians will say that the currency of their moral value system is lack of pain or pleasure, right? And you can interpret that in different ways, but assume, let's just take those on face value. And these are really useful currencies because they're non-derivative. Okay, so what non-derivative means is you can't derive them further back. So if you say, why did you give $5 to that guy begging on the side of the road? You say because I wanted him to have a cup of. Why do you want him to have a cup of coffee? No, no, no. And it ends up being, well, I wanted him to have pleasure, or I wanted him to have a lack of pain, or I wanted most people to have pleasure. That or whatever. How are you going to calculate that? Now, my question for you is. That's really useful, and I find that at least a decent rule of thumb for evaluating moral decisions. The question is, is there a pluralism of currencies? And so, for example, when you say knowledge is good, does knowledge have intrinsic value, or is knowledge only good because eventually it will get us to more pleasure and less pain? um and because then when you were reducing our moral truths about the world that you've been talking about the universe, and you're talking about suffering as being this foundational logical kind of truth, um are there other pluralistic ideas that you can throw into that, or is it just about suffering and lack of pain?
Yeah. No, I mean, I was just giving an example of something that, like, a very basic, like, moral
Yeah.
truth. But, yeah, I'm not really a utilitarian. I'm kind of in the same boat as you, I think. Sometimes I say I caucus with the utilitarians, but I'm not really like one of them.
Mm,
Um, because I am also kind of like a pluralist when it comes to these normative theories, not meta-ethical theories, but like normative theories like utilitarianism and deontology and virtue ethics and even things like honor culture. Like, I think that they all have value, and like they all are kind of true in some sense, but they have limits. None of them provide like a perfect analysis of what it means for something to be right or wrong, including utilitarianism, which I think is like, you know, I think it's the most like valiant effort that we've made at trying to come up with like this very simple theoretical explanation of what rightness and wrongness actually
mm,
mean. And I feel like it was like pretty good, but it's the simplest formulations of it. There are counterexamples to
yeah.
it. So if you say like, well, what's good is maximizing the positively valenced experiences of sentient creatures and minimizing the negatively valenced experiences of sentient creatures. If you take that very simple one sentence formulation of utilitarianism, you can think of counterexamples where you are doing that, and yet what you're doing seems wrong.
So the, the
So,
common example is Emerson Green goes into a hospital. The doctor says, "Oh, come here, Emerson. You're a healthy young man. I'm going to take your body. I'm going to split it into 5 parts because actually there are 5 different people who are really suffering at the moment. Someone could do with your liver, someone could do with your whatever, and you get chopped up into pieces and then used to give value to 5 other people." And then there's something intuitively wrong about that happening, and but it's like the trolley experiment, but taken to a different put into a different context. But interestingly, with consequentialism and utilitarianism, but consequentialism as a broader umbrella, there are so many different nuanced consequentialist positions that take into account these problems. So then people go, okay, let's go and
a
put a
lot of
few
them, they
add-ons to
just they just
this.
bite the bullet. I mean, a lot of them. Some of them try to say like, oh well, in the
Or
real
they do
world,
that, yeah.
yeah. I mean, some of them try to say, well, in the real world, that's not how it would happen. And it's like, when we're off in thought experiment land, which I have lots of complaints about, but, when you're off in thought experiment land, you're supposed to just go along with the stipulations of the thought experiment. So you can just say, well, no one will ever find out that the doctor did that. So there's not going to be like a mass panic. And then like everyone's afraid to go to the hospital. That'll obviously net more suffering in the long run, or even just the short run, because people are afraid to go to the hospital because they're going to get chopped up by their doctors. Yeah, so yeah, obviously that's what would happen is people would find out about it, and then there'd be a news story, and no one would go to the hospital for one. So yeah, like, but what you're supposed to do when you're in this like stupid thought experiment land is you're supposed to go along with the stipulations and say, okay, even though that's not how it would go in the real world, and even though my intuitions evolved in the real world, I'm supposed to trust my intuitions in the not real world. That's supposed to count for something. Again, I have lots of complaints about ethical thought experiments, but that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to just go along with the stipulations. And the utilitarians who do that, they just bite the bullet. They're just like, yeah, the doctor should do that. Or like the utility monster, like earlier I made the apparently very controversial statement that it's wrong to torture infants for the fun of it. Lots of people in the live chat telling me how idiotic I am for thinking such a thing. But yeah, I think it's like objectively wrong to torture infants for the fun of it. And yeah, it has nothing to do with being upset by it. I'm saying that it's wrong. So, but what if it was like really, really fun? So this is like the utility monster. Like, what if it was really, really fun to for one particular person to torture an infant for fun? Like, you can't even imagine how fun it is. Then the utilitarian would be committed to biting that bullet and saying like, well, then yeah, that particular utility monster type creature should torture infants for fun because it's just so fun. Whereas I think you just shouldn't torture infants for fun, even if it's really, really fun.
I mean, this is why I think morality and psychology are intrinsically linked, or there's this integration of morality and psychology, because I would say that there's a huge importance to something like the golden rule. So do unto others as you'd have done unto yourself. So in that situation, I say, well, I wouldn't want that done to me, even though I'm getting pleasure by torturing this infant or whatever. I wouldn't want to be that infant. I understand that. So there's an importance to play, and we can see this in experiments. So the trolley experiment, and just to remind people of that. So there's a trolley going down a railway track. There's 5 people working on a track. It's just about a mow down to 5 people. You pull a lever, it will go and only kill one person who's working on another track. So, and then there's this alternative, which is instead of pulling a lever, it's the same calculation. There's someone who's sufficiently large enough on the bridge. If you push them off the bridge, they fall onto the track and block the truck. It kills that person, but it saves the other 5. So it turns out something like 89% of people will pull the lever. But in the lever case, but when it comes to physically pushing someone off, that percentage is reversed. But it's exactly the same calculation. The only difference is there's some kind of physical element of you pushing someone, and it's the same with like Enola Gay and the Hiroshima Nagasaki nuclear atom bombs, which is they can press a button to release that, but if you ask them to go and literally kill 80,000 people, 100,000 people with a gun or something, they wouldn't do that. So there is this kind of overlap between descriptive morality and normative morality, and I think psychology is hugely important. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of moral disagreement and moral confusion does come from like our rational limitations, like our cognitive biases and so forth. So I feel like with the trolley example, what explains that is that it's quite abstract in one case where you're just thinking, well, would it be better if one person
Yeah,
died or 5 people died? And it's like, well,
yeah,
obviously you'd prefer only one person instead of 5 people. But then you think, what if you have to kill the one person? It's like, well, I don't think you should kill people. And
yeah,
it's like, so I feel like, when you make it more real for people, like, no, you would have to kill someone. They're like, well, killing people is wrong. So I can't do that. Even though, of course, I can recognize in the abstract that it would be better if only one person died instead of 5 people. Yeah, but yeah, moral psychology is definitely important. It can help us understand um, moral motivation, which is a lot more complicated than just assessing moral reasons.
mm,
And it can also help us understand moral disagreement, because I think that the same sources of disagreement in every other context are also present in moral discussions. So people disagree about what's real, and of course that doesn't imply that nothing is real. And people disagree about what we should do. That doesn't mean that, morality is just like a human construction or something. People disagree about who shot JFK, but there's still a fact of the matter about who did it and why they did it. Um, but yeah, I think that there are good analogies to be drawn with like moral disagreement and non-moral disagreement. Like it's in practice very hard to resolve certain non-moral disagreements, but that doesn't mean that there's no fact of the matter. Just basic epistemology is really hard, before you even bring morality into it. But that again, it doesn't mean that there's like no fact of the matter or it's not real or something.
well, yeah. So that kind of comes on to my next point, which is going to be pretty much along those lines, which is that if it's all about epistemology, well, not all about. So if there are moral facts out there, but how do we? Okay, Here's a question: there are moral facts out there, as according to you. How do we discover them?
I think really basic ones we discover through intuition. You know, like we understand that 3 is greater than 2 just by reflecting on the nature of 3 and the nature of 2 and what greater than means. I think when we contemplate really basic moral statements or really clear-cut moral examples, once we understand what all the relevant terms mean, it's just kind of obvious that it's right or wrong. And we don't really observe it the way that we observe like physical things. Like we don't really like perceive 3 being greater than 2 in the same way that I perceive like an orange, object in front of me right now. Yeah, so it's not really about
Do you think that
perception.
intuition, though? Do you think that intuition is based on the empirical data of seeing suffering? So, for example, I
Mhm.
go back to this idea of Schwerbe's or whatever. Like,
No, just to
unless
answer your question, it's a really
sorry,
short
sorry,
answer
yeah,
for me. It's
yeah,
the answer is partially like yes. So we see suffering, but the claim about suffering being wrong is what we don't observe.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, so the idea, like, this is the idea of what is intuition as well. So the people, there's a great book by David Eagleman called Incognito, and talks about intuition. You used to get these World War II plane spotters in Britain. You had to know what plane was going overhead, because if you didn't, then it could be a bomber. So you want to be shooting at the ones that are bombers and not shooting and blah blah blah. But it turns out that people didn't really know how to differentiate; they just knew. And like the same with chicken sexes. So they're apparently people who profess chicken sex. Literally, they pick up the chicks, male, female, male, and they want to keep the females, and they just kind of know, and there's no like rationale behind it, but it is empirical. There's something going on that's empirical, which is to say that if I have no intuitions about whether Schwerbis is right or wrong as an action, as an alien action, but once I understand what it is, then it becomes about me having knowledge about the consequences of a given action. And so, is it intuition just merely actually? It's not about some kind of, I don't know, access to some truth, but just a recognition of what is like suffering and not
Mhm.
suffering. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't think moral naturalism is like crazy or anything. I tend to think that, well, I mean, I guess a way of illustrating this is like the is-ought gap. Like when I first read about this, like, however many years ago, I thought that David Hume was pretty on point. Like I thought he was identifying something that was pretty insightful, and like true.
Do you want
Um,
to just explain the is-ought gap?
yeah. So like in the original passage, he's talking about when people, well, never mind about the original passage. I don't remember it well enough off the top of my head, but the is-ought gap is just kind of like you can talk about descriptive statements, things that are just, it is a fact that this person will suffer tremendously if you set them on fire. But then there's this evaluative or normative statement, like it is bad to set them on fire because it causes them lots of pain. But those are like not really the same thing. Like one is they're on fire, that will cause them a lot of pain. And then there's this evaluative, you know, um, sort of ought claim about, well, you ought not cause people lots of pain, you know? So Hume's point was like, a lot of people kind of, sneakily move from one to the other without really explaining how they did that. Like they'll just start with, if I do this, it will cause lots of pain. And of course, that's very bad. And it's like, well, hang on, you started off with a descriptive claim and then you ended with an evaluative claim. So an evaluative claim is just when something is good or bad or positive or negative in a certain respect. And moral claims are a particular type of evaluative claim. So you start with this descriptive thing that no one would really disagree with, and then you end with this kind of evaluative claim, about the goodness or badness or rightness or wrongness, or you ought to do this or you ought not do that, or you should do this or shouldn't do that. And he was just kind of, you know, I don't remember exactly the point he went with it, but the thing is like that sort of thing can help you understand the difference between naturalists and non-naturalists. It's not exactly right, but
Well, I was just going to say, because that
yeah.
that seems very much like the Sam Harris moral landscape, which is you look at well-being and it's axiomatically or intuitively, good, and therefore that is good. And a moral value system is maximizing well-being. There you go. And it's empirical and scientific and etc. etc.
Yeah. Like, so Sam Harris has talked about how the is-ought gap is like silly, and he thinks that like Hume was like off his rocker for even suggesting that there was this gap. And like, Sam Harris has made these kind of extreme claims about like even like moral semantics, it seems like, where he's saying that, well, that's just what it means. Like suffering is just what it means for something to be bad. And for something to be bad is just, it means that something is suffering. So it's not a perfect analogy or not a perfect illustration of the difference between naturalist and non-naturalist, but it's like that kind of insight has kind of guided me more towards the like non-naturalist side of things, because I think Hume was right that if you want an evaluative truth or an evaluative claim, then it's just kind of irreducible. Like you can't bridge this gap between is and ought.
So, and there are then parallels between physicalism and non-physicalism. Well, it's interesting that there are interesting, asides you can have, in the same way that you said that, the physical world, this isn't quite enough to explain things like qualitative feelings, but also, arguably this realm of logic and this realm of moral truths, is that explainable by physicalism? So there are these interesting connections between these different fields of.
No, it is, because I believe that the world is very like diverse and varied, and it's not just like this really simple oh, it's all just physical stuff and everything is explainable just in terms of like the evolution of the wave function or something. Like I used to have that kind of worldview, and it's appealing in its simplicity, but there is a trade-off between simplicity and explanatory power. So if you expand your ontology, yeah, you have a decrease in simplicity, but you have this increase in explanatory power. So it's often worth it. Like you could be a solipsist and have like the most theoretically simple, ontology imaginable, but you trade off a lot of explanatory power.
Just to explain, a solipsist for those viewers is someone who believes that everything else doesn't exist. You're the only person and mind that exists. In fact, there's my one philosophical joke is that you go to a philosophical faculty, and you walk in, and you get introduced to to the faculty by these students that say, "Oh, this is Dr. Green. He's awesome. We really look after him." It's like, really? Yeah, we just treat him so well. He's just, we do everything for him, everything he wants. We just make sure he's always super happy and that he lives as long as possible. And you're like, why is that? That's weird. Well, he's a solipsist, because so if he goes, we all go. But anyway, that's my joke.
Yeah. It's like the woman who wrote Bertrand Russell and said, "Oh, I was so glad to hear you're a solipsist. There's so few of us these days."
Brilliant.
Yeah. He was not a solipsist, by the way.
Ottangelo Grasso, our favorite theist, has come along and said there can be no, and I'd be interested to see what you say to this, there can be no objective moral truths and values without ought to be's than are enforced by God. Atheists, in order to make sense of our world, need to borrow constantly from the Christian worldview.
So I don't know if he means that God is enforcing the moral law, like because he's like a cosmic policeman who threatens us with punishment and offers us reward if we follow those oughts, and that's why because he said he used the word enforced by God. And, I don't think there's any enforcement of these rules other than our consciences, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I think that we just see that something is right or wrong, and, we're moral agents. So, yeah, I mean, just like we're rational agents, so we can see if something is contradictory. We don't want to have contradictory beliefs. So you feel this like pressure, like, oh, I don't want to believe this thing. It's totally inconsistent. And because you're a moral agent, you see that something is wrong, and you at least have some reason not to do it as a result of just seeing that it's wrong. But if you're saying that that's all just complete nonsense, and no, we would just, rape and kill and torture each other constantly if God wasn't like threatening us not to, then again, you're not really a moral realist in any sense that I can tell, because you just think that there's a really powerful person who makes the rules and we have to follow those rules or else. That's nothing like moral realism. That's a completely different thing. Sorry to sound like a new atheist here, but that is just dictatorship.
Yeah, so that often you hear this term morally binding, right? And quite often it just means that yeah, exactly like you say, it's sort of cosmic police person. Um, yes, he is the one that provides justice. There will be ultimate judgment where all our words and actions will be judged. Without God, there can be no justice, and our world will
Completely
be
different fucking
unjust.
claim that has nothing to do with the previous thing you just said. Like, I just get so I don't really talk to apologists like this, like, ever, because he's just gonna go on saying the same stupid bullshit, like, like, it doesn't matter what I say right now. Like, again, nothing he says undermines moral naturalism or moral non-naturalism. He didn't even try. I doubt he understood it. And then now he's talking about a completely different concern about, like, there will be no ultimate justice if which, by the way, there won't be ultimate justice if your God does exist, because people are saved through grace and not through works. And I don't really see what's just about someone converting on their deathbed and being saved, and Anne Frank burning in hell because she was Jewish. So I mean, there will be an ultimate judgment where all our words and actions will be judged. Without God, there can be no justice. No, I mean, human beings do create a fair amount of justice. So again, just not true. But yeah, God doesn't really ensure ultimate justice. I mean, you believe in, like, salvation through grace and not through works, so it doesn't matter what you did. It only matters that you accept the right propositions and believe the right things, and then you get to go to heaven. And if you believe the wrong things, it doesn't matter how good of a person you were. If you were a good person, at least relative to other people, and but you believe the wrong things, then you're going to go to hell. So you don't really believe in this ultimate justice, and neither
And
does any other
especially when
person.
some of those things that you believe wrongly, you have no control over. So the time and place that you were born, for example, that then affect what your beliefs thereafter are.
Yeah.
But it's okay because grace is just because Jesus pays for our sins.
What does that mean? Like, grace and justice are not the same thing.
I
Like,
mean,
grace isn't it supposed to be like, what would be just is you being tortured in hell for all eternity for your sins. That's what justice would be. But God has, like, mercy and grace on you, and that's what, isn't that part of the story?
I mean, this is the idea that justice and mercy are indeed, not mutually compatible ideals. God can't be perfectly just and perfectly merciful at the same time because
No,
one
but
is
I thought
the
that we
opposite of
were
the other.
like, what we deserve is hell, but then God through grace, like, rescues us from that. But now
Yeah,
he's saying that no, it's actually, you don't deserve hell. I mean, like, again,
because
I think you
grace
might not
is
understand
just.
Christianity.
Well, I think you've nailed one of the issues there. And I'll just give him a final crack of the whip here. So, if nature is all there is, the woman who was raped and her rapist was never captured and put on trial will never see justice. But if God exists, she can have hope that He will pay one day.
Unless she was a Hindu and he was a Christian.
Interesting.
Then what? So you don't
Yeah.
believe in ultimate justice.
So this is something that just happens so often with theists, which is like and this is actually linked to kind of meaning. This kind of justice and meaning is sort of similar there, and it's all about the eternality to it. So you can have don't you can't have justice if 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 there isn't some kind of eternal lawgiver that can balance the books and the unfairness. I mean, this is exactly why heaven and hell were invented in the intertestamental period, which is, why is bad stuff happening to good people and good stuff happening to bad people? There was no heaven and hell in the Old Testament, which is odd. So here's a Christian that believes, that the Bible is correct, but actually there's no mention of eternal life and heaven and hell in the Old Testament. None at all.
Well, can
Uh,
I just say that
yeah,
all this stuff about justice, has literally nothing to do with, hey, are there moral facts?
yeah.
Are there objectively right and wrong answers to questions like, hey, is it better to help an infant and nurture it or brutalize it? Is there a fact of the matter about that, or is it all just your opinion, or is neither true nor false that one is better than the other, or something like that? Or it's false that that one is better than the other. Again, nothing to do with whether there's ultimate justice, and also nothing to do with whether God exists. But it's with the ultimate justice thing. It's like it's even more obvious that, like, you know he just changed the subject, and, like, this is what so many, like, religious apologists will do, is they'll just skip from one thing to the next to the next to the next to the next, and it's like, you know anyway, we started off talking about whether or not there were moral facts, and then he said, well, we need an enforcer. Okay, well, that's not the same question. And then he's like, well, there's no ultimate justice. Okay, even more not the same question. And then now he's saying, if naturalism is true, there is no good or evil. There are just flowing molecules. Well, once again, I've been explaining that there are two very old positions, some of which are held by theists, by the way, that are compatible with naturalism. One of them is called ethical naturalism, and the other one is called ethical non-naturalism. And once again, this is just in the context of metaethics, has nothing to do with theism or naturalism in other contexts. But yeah, it's like these are pretty well elaborated metaethical theories, and they could be true if God exists, and they could be true if God doesn't exist. It doesn't matter. So if naturalism is true, meaning there's only the natural world, then there could indeed be good and evil, and right and wrong, and facts about certain actions being better than other actions. And he's done nothing other than just like blankly assert, that that's not true. Okay, well, okay, here's like a practical thing to that guy and to the like hordes of other apologists who say the same kind of thing. Explain why you don't accept moral non-naturalism, or at least illustrate to me that you've heard of it or you know what it is, because I bet you don't. Like, I bet you've never even heard of it. And again, this is not like a new thing. This is not like, it's not really talked about in apologetics literature, and it's not. I feel like I might be giving the wrong impression, like, oh, how dare you not know about this, or you're stupid for not knowing about this, which is not my
Well, this
point.
is actually what you
Not
said
my
at the
point.
beginning of the talk. Actually, you said what annoys you is that not enough people know about this, and then lo and
Yeah,
behold, like there's an exemplification of this.
they don't know about the metaethical landscape, so it's not like that guy has principled reasons for rejecting moral non-naturalism. And I bet if you put a gun to his head, he couldn't tell you what it was. But he's dead certain it's wrong. He doesn't know what it is, but he knows it's wrong. What makes your
Uh,
claim true that raping a child is wrong? Again, man, like, okay, so on moral naturalism and moral non-naturalism, there are moral facts. There are things that are right and wrong, independent of people's feelings, just like there are logical truths or mathematical truths that are, the case, regardless of how anyone feels about them. So I think that certain moral claims are the same way. That it's just a fact about our world. It just happens to be the case. If you're a moral naturalist, that something like that is immoral, and in my case, as a moral non-naturalist, I think there's no alternative. Like, I think that it had to be this way. There's no world in which you can, harm a child, and then like for no good reason, and then that would be the good thing to do. So I think that these moral truths are necessary truths that obtain in all possible worlds. It literally could not have been otherwise. There's no world in which God could have commanded it so that raping a child was a good thing. You do believe that because you're a moral subjectivist, but I actually believe in objective morality, unlike you.
so, Tanjo, what you're saying there is that you're a subjectivist because you believe in just the subjective morality of the God. And interestingly, we get to the epistemological problem with Tangelo, which is how do you know you've got the right God? How do you know that you have interpreted God's commands correctly, and that someone else who's a Christian who believes differently to you is wrong? How do you do that calculation without using moral reasoning that is independent of God? Your problem, Atangelo, is an epistemological problem. Now, what Emerson is saying here, and again, I don't wholly agree with Emerson's entire moral worldview here, but that there are, in the same way that there's 2 + 2 = 4, is just a basic property of the universe. Property is probably the wrong word, but a basic fact of the universe, and that itself is independent of whether God exists or not. And many theists might agree that as well. And this is actually open to debate within theism. Kind of, again, we're back to the argument about a priori facts. Is logic an a priori fact of the universe? This is like a hugely, you know, long-standing argument within philosophy. A priori versus a posteriori. Are there like facts that are true about the universe absent of like empirical data and whatnot? And I guess what Emerson is saying is that this will include, if it includes like the laws of logic that define mathematics, there are laws of logic that define moral truths as well.
Yeah, like if you take his question, why is raping a child wrong? Like, so let's put that question to you. Well, God commanded us not to do that, even though he never did. But can you take that off the screen? I'm tired of reading his
Yeah.
thoughts. But no, I mean, if you ask, so why did God command us not to rape children? He never did, by the way, but let's just say that he did do that. So why did he do that? Is it because it's wrong? Well, why is it wrong? Okay, well, now you're in the same boat that I'm in, of trying to explain how things are right and wrong, even though there's no like enforcer who's like just telling us that they're right or wrong. But yeah, if God just commands it arbitrarily, then once again, you are just this moral subjectivist. You don't actually believe in objective morality. Like you're completely wrong-headed about this, where you think that you're defending objective morality because it's based on God, you know. Whereas I'm actually defending objective morality. Like I think that certain things are wrong, not just in our universe, but in any universe that could have existed. Certain things would still be wrong, but you don't believe that. You think that if God commanded something differently, then that would be right. But then they might turn around and say, well, God wouldn't command that. And why is that? Because there are necessary moral truths. He has moral reasons for commanding this and not some other thing. So you're either in the same boat as me, as a non-naturalist, or you're a moral subjectivist and you don't even believe in objective morality. I'm the one who believes in objective morality.
Brilliant. And again, he will suffer from all of the epistemological problems that divine command theorists, because I presume he's a divine command theorist, because the options for theists are quite thin on the ground. It used to be a theistic moral value system that was far more adhered to natural law, and there are just kind of different understandings of natural law. So you can have the understanding that it is written on our hearts, that naturally it's almost like a moral intuitionism. But then there's a kind of natural law theory of Catholic sort of thought that again, I don't want to get into that, but other than that, it really is divine command theory. There just aren't that many other forms of theistic morality.
Well, I mean, I think those are two slightly separable issues. Like one of them is the more meta-ethical claim about like what grounds right and wrong. And then the other one is more about like what explains like what we should do, I guess. Like because I'm just saying that there are facts about, morals. Like we make moral claims, they're truth apt, they can be true or false, and some of them are true, and not just because, not like true for me and not true for you, but like they're objectively true. So that's all that I'm really saying. And that's totally compatible with utilitarianism or deontology or natural law theory or virtue ethics or anything like that. I mean, you could be a natural law theorist and an atheist. So I just think they're kind of separable. Like the meta-ethical question that I'm interested in is more about like, are there moral facts? When I say this thing is better than this other thing, is that true? So certain anti-realists would say, no, it's not true because it's neither true nor false. Like, moral claims, they're not really claims, they're not really beliefs, they're more like emotional expressions, or they're like commands or something. And then there are some moral anti-realists who say, no, like all these moral claims are just false, and then there are still other moral realists who believe, well, okay, it's true, but it's only subjectively true. It could be true for one society and not true for another society, or true for me and not true for you. You like the Holocaust ice cream and I like the not Holocaust ice cream. And again, that just seems inaccurate to me. I think that some things are right and other things are wrong, and objectively so. It doesn't depend how you feel about it. It's just a fact that some things are right and other things are wrong. So that rules out all the forms of anti-realism, because I don't think that moral claims are neither true nor false. I don't think they're all false. I think some of them are true and some of them are objectively true, regardless of how you feel about them. So that's why I'm a moral realist. And that's compatible with being a utilitarian or a natural law theorist or a deontologist or what have you.
Exactly. And indeed, so I will just put up this last one from Otangio, because this kind of shows that he hasn't taken on board what you've said. If naturalism is true, there are no moral facts. Well, you said there are, but in the same way that, look, Otangelo, I guess you would believe, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I guess you believe that without God, there would be no logic. So is logic contingent upon God, or does logic exist outside of God? Because I guess, would you agree that that's the core issue at play here?
I mean,
I'm asking you, Emerson.
Oh, well, I mean, what he has on the screen here is just roughly the first premise of the moral argument.
Yeah.
And like I said, there's nothing that he said that is even an attempted justification at that. He started rambling on about ultimate justice at some point, which he as a Christian does not believe in. And at another point, he started talking about something else. I don't really remember. But yeah, I mean, the justification for this premise is like non-existent. Like there's no, again, it almost seems as out there as like, if naturalism is true, there are no toasters. And it's just like, you can't justify toasters, if you're a naturalist. And it's like, why? And they start talking about something else. It's so frustrating, because like there's really no rationale behind that. Because first of all, this guy in particular does not believe in objective morality, and neither does any other divine command theorist. And second of all, there's no justification of the idea of like, oh, well, if there is no God, then there's no objective morality. They never explain why that is. They, like they just never really bother explaining, oh, well, here's moral naturalism. Let me just demonstrate I even understand what that is, and here's why it fails. And here's moral non-naturalism. Here's a short explanation of it, and here's why that fails. That has never happened. Like for like 99% of the people who defend the moral argument for God, who defend something like what's on the screen right now, they just don't do that. They don't do their due diligence. And yeah, like I said, this is not an issue in like the meta ethics literature. Like this is just a massive, disconnect between what's happening in like pop apologetics, and including, and atheists get sucked into this too. It's actually pretty sad because they fall for this like Christian propaganda, which I think is like the appropriate word for it, that if naturalism is true, there are no moral facts. If God doesn't exist, nothing is really right or wrong. Nihilism must be true. That is ridiculous. Like it's so disconnected. Like, yeah, it's a horrible argument. There's no plausible justification for that premise at all. And a lot of atheists sadly fall for it. I fell for it for a short time after I deconverted, but it's just not true.
And I guess as we meander towards the end, and I'll ask you whether there's anything else you want to add to this. I know Lance Independent, who you've had some previous with, is saying he would like to have a conversation with you another time. Whether that's anything that would ever happen, I don't know. But he said that he questions your interpretation of moral error theory, and says there are other options. And he talks about meta-ethical quietism as another available position, but says that so he says, to explain that, quietists in philosophy can reject portions of the philosophical dialectic as confused. As such, a framework which is prompting one to insist that there's three anti-realist views can be rejected. So this is the idea that you talk about there being three views, and that moral error theory, or the way that you describe moral error theory, and saying there's no difference between dropping a piece of paper and murdering a child, is a problem. He says that actually that's not necessarily what moral error theorists believe. But I don't know whether
my
this is something you
description
want to
of
get into.
error theory is that moral claims that attribute a positive, like evaluative property to the world, are false. And that is just the definition of error theory, that all moral claims are false. That's what error theory means. If you find that implausible, as 95% of philosophers do in the Phil Paper survey, then you are not an error theorist.
Yes, I'll just as I've just got this here now. I will. Where are you? No, wrong one. I've lost you. There you are. If I could just to let people know a definition of moral error theory. Let's just see this. Share. Okay, so moral error theorist thinks, this is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, thinks that although our moral judgments aim at the truth, they systematically fail to secure it. The world simply doesn't contain the relevant stuff to render our moral judgments true. For a more familiar analogy, compare what an atheist usually claims about religious judgments. On the face of it, religious discourse is cognitivist in nature. So
They're
that means
truth
that
apt.
there are truths.
They're trying to
truths.
say something true. Like they're truth
Yeah.
apt claims about the world, but they're all wrong.
Yeah, it would seem that when someone says God exists or God loves you, they are usually asserting something that purports to be true. However, according to the atheists, the world isn't furnished with the right kind of stuff, gods, afterlife, miracles, etc., necessary to render these assertions true. It's neither true nor false. They're just like not in that realm. The moral error theorist claims that when we say stealing is morally wrong, we are asserting that the act of stealing instantiates a property of moral wrongness. But in fact, there is no such property, or at least nothing in the world instantiates it, and thus the utterance is untrue.
Mm-hmm.
I presume that's what you were establishing.
Yeah, their attempt, like that entry said, error theorists believe that we're trying to say things about the world. We're trying to make moral claims, and they're all systematically false. Like we're wrong every single time. We are trying and failing to secure these truths about the world. Whereas like the non-cognitivist or expressivist or some other people think that this is all just totally confused and it's neither true nor false. So you can call it whatever you want, but when you are looking at a proposition, there are only so many things you can do with it. You can either say it's false, you can say it's true, and you can mean different things by true. Or you can say, actually, this whole thing is just kind of screwed up from the beginning. It's neither true nor false.
I've got a lot of time for Lance Independent here, who's although he's had disagreements with you, Emerson, in the past, obviously, he's taken a hot Sancho Grosso. So I don't think you should accept someone else telling you what your beliefs are. You do think morality is objective, don't you? And he's just telling you don't think it is.
Yeah, and I gave reasons for that. It's
Yeah.
because he thinks that if God commanded something, then it would be good, and if he commanded the opposite thing next week, it would also be good. And there's no contradiction between me saying like, I like vanilla ice cream, and then next week I say, actually, I don't like it anymore. And that's because it's sort of a subjective truth, Whereas like I can't say, well, the Earth is 6,000 years old, and then now it's not, and I was objectively right both times. So I mean, divine command theory, if you're basing moral truths on God, and sometimes his commands change, as they appear to have changed from time to time, then I mean, obviously you're a subjectivist. First of all, you're basing it on the attitudes or reactions or feelings or whatever of some observer, which means it's a form of subjectivism by definition. But then it's further confirmed by the fact that you think that if God commands opposite things, then they're both right. And if God ceased to exist, then there would be no morals. Okay, so you're not an objectivist.
I think that's a really good point that you brought up. Actually, the difference in moral command. So if you take something like the Bible as some kind of great moral revelation, there's something that Justin Schieber used to call intertestamental or intercovenantal moral relativism, which is the idea that eating shellfish is wrong up until this period in time, and then it's okay. Or like
and they were both right.
Wearing two types of material together is wrong until suddenly it's right. And there's only like history and geography as context to deliver the moral correctness of that. And
does that sound like some other position, like different cultures, some things are right for some cultures and wrong for other cultures? Is there a term for that? Is it moral? Are those people moral realists? The people who think that moral truths are relative between cultures? Is that a form of fucking realism?
Yeah. So, and I think that this is a really good point. So if someone like, for example, Tanjo Grasso says, morality doesn't exist without God, and I believe in God, therefore I believe in objective morality, all you need to do, as well as like divine command theory, I've got 16 reasons why that doesn't work. So divine command theory, if that's your morality, is totally broken, like utterly broken. But one of those arguments in there is this moral relativism, which is, if you really believe in objective morality, how does it work that the early parts of the Bible made some moral claims that were somehow right then, but then were wrong at a later point? It just I don't get it. So you need to explain that, theist, but you never do.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't really vibe with moral anti-realists very much. Like I think they're putting forward a very implausible view that's like totally unmotivated. And it's like, I mean, the main motivation, I suppose, because sometimes there will be this kind of burden shifting that's sort of unhelpful, where it's like, I'm saying, well, the default position is realism because it seems like things are right and wrong to everybody, and then, so that's why it's the default position, right? Like we assume that things are the way they seem in the absence of defeaters. There are not really any great defeaters, so moral realism almost just wins by default. And then moral anti-realist will say, well, my theory is so much more simple. It's such a simpler ontology. And there are like no good arguments for moral realism or whatever. So we both, I mean, it is kind of unfortunate because there's kind of a similar move that I see on both sides sometimes, where it's like, well, there aren't any great arguments for your position, the anti-realist, or they'll say, hey, there aren't any good arguments for your position, the realist, and mine is kind of the default starting point, so I win because, anti-realism is simpler. Or I say, well, phenomenal conservatism is true. And like, so that's why moral realism, is the default view. So I guess that's the main motivation that I see from moral anti-realists, which is just kind of like a parsimony or simplicity thing where it's like, Oh, I guess that my ontology is simpler as a moral anti-realist, and then they, there's more. Obviously, they offer more arguments. I'm just saying that like none of them are any good, and like kind of obviously so. But yeah, it does just at the end of the day, it seems like a pretty unmotivated position that is wildly contrary to our common sense everyday picture of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I would disagree because I'm a moral anti-realist. Or well, I need for me, it's all about what is the ontology of logic, how logic plays a part in, because if you're saying that basically these are effectively almost in the same category as the law of non-contradiction. So the law of non-contradiction, to those out there, is that you know a a cannot equal not a at the same time. So you know if a, then you can't have not a as well. That's a really like I probably butchered that, but so uh, that seems to be a very basic principle of how the universe works, because you just wouldn't have existence without that kind of principle. I guess the question is there a discernible difference between some kind of is it a logical principle that there is some kind of claim about suffering at the base of reality?
Well, I mean, I think that these things are good comparisons, but they're not like exactly the same. If
No.
they were exactly the same, they would just be identical. But they're
Well,
not identical. They're just
well, yeah, that's
comparisons.
what I'm
So,
saying. Like whether they're the same category of kind of logical truths.
well, they're in their own category. But what I'm saying is like I draw these things as like comparisons, which are helpful comparisons, but they're
Mm.
not identical. If they were identical, they would be the same thing. But
Yeah,
I do think that what you're bringing up the logical truth stuff, and moral naturalists don't think the same way. So they think that there are objectively right and wrong answers to moral questions, and they don't view moral truths as like these non-natural things that we apprehend through rational intuition. That's more on the non-naturalist side. So there's this divide between moral realists, and I'm more on the side that you're talking about. But you know, just because you reject like this idea, Platonism or whatever it is, like some particular view about abstract objects, that doesn't automatically commit you to moral anti-realism. You can still be a realist. You would just be more on the naturalist side instead of the non-naturalist side.
yeah. I don't disagree. So which is why I haven't often called myself a moral anti-realist or realist, because I prefer to just not use any of those labels and just say what I think I am. But again, I think morality is just not simple, and it's a complex, nuanced subject. And I think you know when you have people come along saying objective morality using the moral argument, you think you are really simplifying like a hugely potentially complex subject that involves a lot of other areas of philosophy that's just not doing justice to the
Well, it's
conversation.
sort of like saying, you know, if atheism is true, then you ought to be like a Democrat or something. And it's like, but you shouldn't be a Democrat or so. I don't know. Like, I'm just saying, like the thing they key in on is like it's such a controversial premise, and there are like so many counterexamples to it that like it's just hard to take seriously. Even though yes, there are many atheists who are moral anti-realists, and there are many atheists who are Democrats, but that doesn't mean there's some kind of like essential logical connection between these things. And anyone who doesn't fall into that is like dishonest or like somehow you know, like not being straight with you in some way or another.
So I guess for the viewers here, like the question for you, whether you are atheist or not atheist, well, if you are atheist, is like, do you believe there are moral facts in the universe, and how do you account for morality, and how do you how do you know what those moral facts are? That's an epistemological question, but also
Mhm.
in what way do these moral facts exist? And I guess if you're the theist, it's like trying to establish how divine command theory works. Would be a good start, and how you're not intertestamental. Well, if you're a Christian, an intertestamental moral relativist. So Otangelo, it'd be interesting to see what you really think about that, and how you actually deal with the issues of divine command theory.
And there are plenty of theists who are not divine command theorists. Like all of the smartest theists I know, like all the Christians who I respect, none of them are divine command theorists. Like I mean, probably 99% of them are not divine command theorists. And a lot of them also don't accept this kind of like relativism between the Old Testament and New Testament. They've got an understanding of it that is kind of implausible to me. Like if you've ever listened to Randall Rouser talk about, you know, oh, God didn't command genocide or something like that. You know, again, I don't find it that plausible, but like he's actually sensitive to the kinds of moral concerns that people who are not totally corrupted by religion would have, like where he's like, you know, his moral faculties have not been so warped by Christianity that he can see, oh yeah, genocide is bad, even when God commands it in the Bible. So, but then he thinks like, well, how does that make any sense that God would have commanded genocide? Like he must not have. So he does try to work it out, like through like biblical like interpretation and stuff. And like I said, I don't really find it that plausible at the end of the day, but still there are plenty of theists who don't do the kinds of things that these like F-tier Christian apologists do.
I always, you know, the idea of theodicy. So theodicies are explanations of why suffering exists in a world where you supposedly have an all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God. And what always seems to happen is that you are providing usually consequentialist moral sort of reasoning to say, well, this has happens for this reason, and so on and so forth. But there's also a theory that even presenting theodicies is morally problematic, and the claim that if it's the idea that if you are sitting there having to justify genocide, you've probably got the wrong worldview. I mean, really, like, so, and I feel really strongly about this. Like, if because it's all about having God and the Bible up here, and these things are perfect ideals, and they cannot be brought down. But then you got like, oh, there's genocide in the Bible. It's like, okay, right. I need to now work hard to establish how genocide, in this particular instance of genocide, is somehow good. It's like sitting down and going, right, Emerson, your job today is to tell me how the Jewish Holocaust of the Second World War is morally good. Go for it. Good luck with that. And you must be thinking, this
I
is
can
wrong.
argue that it wasn't morally bad. I would only have to be an error theorist. I would only have to be some kind of moral anti-realist, and then I could argue that it actually wasn't bad. I mean, it wasn't good, but it also wasn't bad.
Or at least the truth, the truth claims about them. I mean, there's still like other ways of building up moral value in something. So
you can still be upset by the Holocaust, but it wasn't wrong. I mean, according to like, you know, error theory, like if you say the Holocaust was wrong, that was false. Yeah, according to error theory, and that seems implausible to me.
So and I was going to say something and I've forgotten. So if you've got, we're going to close it up imminently. If you have anything else, any questions for Emerson or any super chats or anything like that, you know, get them in right now as we start closing up. What would you say to sort of finish tying everything together? Is there anything else that you haven't talked about that you'd like to mention?
I guess the main thing that I wanted to mention was that atheists can believe that there are moral facts and that there are objectively right and wrong answers to moral questions. And yeah, don't let anyone tell you that you can't have objective morality without God. It's just not true. And this is the weirdest part of it is that, you know, Sam Harris is a moral realist, and he's, you know, one of the more prominent, you know, figures in like, you know, pop atheism. And I don't think Christopher Hitchens ever said anything that was really anti-realist. I don't know. It's just so weird to me that like someone as prominent as Sam Harris can, you know, say like, look, morality is objective, you know, like obviously. And then like once you get more into philosophy of religion, then you hear the same thing. And it's like it just never seems to get through, even though on the pop level and on the more academic level, there's this pretty much unified front that the moral argument sucks and that like you can have objective morals with or without God. By the way, you can have objective morals with God. I'm just saying divine command theorists don't. But you can obviously have objective morals as an atheist. There are extremely well fleshed out, you know, meta-ethical theories And if you want to defend the moral argument, then you need to undermine those meta-ethical theories, specifically moral naturalism and moral non-naturalism. But no one ever bothers to do this. So if you want to make this ludicrously implausible claim, then that's what you need to do. Okay, and they never do it. But I'm just saying the bottom line is that as an atheist, you don't have to believe in objective morality. Okay, but you can. And for me, this just doesn't have much to do with theism versus atheism. I'm just trying to figure out the way the world is, and some things seem objectively right and other things seem objectively wrong, and I don't know of any good reason to suppose otherwise.
I remember, I think it was Matthew Flanagan, the New Zealand theologian. I think it was him with Eminem. Him and his wife, I think they run some theological whatnot. But I remember having arguments with him about morality, and I'm sure he was. If it's not him, I do apologize. But someone like him, I was arguing with, and they were okay with consequentialism being true. In terms of morality and their belief in God, and I thought that was the first time I came across someone. This is just I'm speaking to what you're saying, that there are theists out there who have far more nuanced understandings of what morality is. What morality is.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I know theists who are utilitarians. I mean, and like I said, the whole distinction between normative ethics, which includes utilitarianism and other theories like that, that's distinct from the meta ethics. So like I don't really think any particular normative theory is true. Like I'm not like a utilitarian or anything. But I do think there are moral facts. I just don't think that we have like a nice and tidy normative structure where you can like summarize the correct theoretical understanding of rightness and wrongness in every case, and there are no counterexamples. So I think there are
That's a
counterexamples
really interesting point that possibly we should have mentioned more in this talk.
Actually, I mentioned it a few times.
Yeah, but bring that together. I think really explicitly that because I would agree that there are no moral value systems at work. Like I said that earlier on, that none of them are perfect. There are counterexamples that disprove them as entire moral value system. But as you say, that is different from saying that there aren't any moral facts, which is your meta-ethical statement and understanding, as opposed to your normative ethical understanding. But
utilitarianism, non-utilitarianism, whatever. All I'm saying here is that you can obviously believe that there are moral facts and like objectively right and wrong answers to certain moral and evaluative questions.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, well, look, thank you so much for that somewhat like round the houses chat about. I think we got a lot of everything that you wanted to say. I think you put out there. If you could, I guess,
anger people some more.
Yeah, I want to understand like how would you? I guess the question is, my final question for you would be, how would you know if you were true? If your position, how would you know that you were right?
Well, like I said, I think that my position is kind of like there are certain moral claims that are kind of self-evident, and there aren't any good defeaters for them. Really basic, like foundational moral truths. But regardless, like the question of moral epistemology and like how do you know? Once again, just want to distinguish it from like whether or not there are moral facts. That's one question, and then how do you know about them is a separate question. And I'm generally like a phenomenal conservative with regards to epistemology. And then when it comes to like resolving disagreements, that is also different from what's the correct theory of epistemology or something like that. So it's also helpful as well to just like switch the claim to something else, because a lot of people, once you go into the moral realm, it's like, I don't know, like everything just goes haywire. And then when you switch it to some other claim, like like a perceptual claim or a mathematical claim or logical claim, the point is not really to say, hey, moral truths are exactly like this. But the point for me is more like, hey, you don't think that there are no truths about empirical reality because people disagree about it, right? Or like, hey, you don't think that like, oh, logic is all just social construction because, some people are illogical or something, or like maybe we wouldn't be able to contemplate these truths if we all blinked out of existence or something like that. But, or like, if you ask, how do we know about logical truths? That's an interesting question. Like, how do we apprehend like logical and mathematical truths? Like, that's an interesting question. How do we know about them? And if we were wrong, how would we know? Like, how would we know that we were like doing something wrong mathematically and some of our foundational mathematical beliefs were just incorrect?
This is where
Like,
it comes
once
to
you talk about those
pragmatism, and
questions,
this is where you come onto other sort of epistemological frameworks that, like pragmatism, would say, well, you know, it's useful, therefore it's true, type thing. I
or
mean, it's
maybe it's
simplifying.
true and that explains why it's useful.
Yeah.
That's my explanation.
Yeah. Yes. Well, it's a bit like believing. Oh no, I was going to get onto the evolutionary argument against naturalism of planting and talking about frogs and eating flies, but I won't. We've run out of time, I'm sure. But onto what you're saying there, it's more like grouping a moral fact along with a mathematical fact as opposed to an aesthetic fact. So I guess a lot of people would say to you, "Oh, it seems like morality is more like just you find that more beautiful than that painting more beautiful that," which is this subjective understanding of aesthetics, and it's people
Mhm.
thinking that morality somehow seems more like that. They're more aligned, morality and aesthetics, rather than morality and maths. And I guess you'd say no, it's more akin to the sort of moral facticity of maths than it is of aesthetics.
Yeah, I mean, like, if you say, "I thought that movie was boring," and I loved it, then I'm not like, "That was inaccurate." Like, that's false what you just said.
I'm gonna try that. I do say that people that do make aesthetic claims like that, and I'm sitting near them, I'm like, actually, you're empirically wrong. You are objectively wrong. That was a shit movie, and you're like, deal with
I'm
it.
like, I'm not like dead set on like aesthetic subjectivism either, but like it does seem way more plausible to me to say like, well, I like vanilla ice cream more than chocolate and you like chocolate more than vanilla and like neither one of us is wrong,
Yeah,
or like you found this boring and I didn't, or you're sexually attracted to this and I'm not.
there
It's
might
like,
be evolutionary reasons why that's the case. I can explain it, but it doesn't make it
yeah,
right or wrong.
but yeah, I mean, just no one's
Intrinsically.
there's no like fact of the matter about who's like correct about this. Whereas like moral claims do seem different to me. Like if someone really believed like, no, it's better to brutalize an infant than to nurture it, I'd be like, that seems incorrect to me. Like that seems wrong. Like you just said something that's untrue. Whereas if someone just says something about ice cream, I'm not like it just doesn't seem like the same kind of claim. So I understand what something subjectively true. I understand what that means. And I understand what it means for something to be objectively true. And moral claims, at least some of them, seem to fit more into the objectively true side of things.
Um, uh, and that's a great place to end. Thank you for that. I think that's a really useful explanation there. Hoodoo Texas, can't we all just get along? Nope. We are human.
No.
It's not going to happen. That's your pragmatic evaluation of humanity. But thank you, Hoodoo. I really appreciate that. Thanks for popping along. This has been a very sort of philosophical have look at morality rather than maybe looking at the Bible and saying, "Oh, this is a terrible excerpt of the Bible," or "This is it," and this abortion is good, abortion is bad, all that kind of stuff. Although I don't think anyone ever really says abortion is good, right? It's not like I don't know if you're an anti-natalist, maybe. Anyway, God, that's
Oh, yeah.
all. Just I want to start right at the end of the conversation. I open up the abortion can of worms. Sorry. Anyway, look, thank you so much, Hoodoo, and thank you to Mitch as well for your support of this channel. Really, really important. Thank you for watching, guys. And there was some pretty lively stuff going on in the chat. Otangelo always provokes people to say stuff, and also Lance Independent completely disagrees with with Emerson, but they've obviously got previous. Anyway, I'll leave them to argue that over a pint on a future time.
I stopped reading the chat a while ago. I just looked over at it on StreamYard and it just says comments 156. Okay, great. I'm sure they're all really positive about me. Everyone's really thrilled about what I've been saying.
I am Emerson. So, and that's all that matters. I'm telling you, that's an objective fact of the
Well,
universe.
being objectively right, it angers a lot of people. I've found this in my own life many, many times.
Brilliant. Excellent. Thank you, Emerson. You're always a pleasure to have on, and let's do this again over a different subject. As ever, guys, question everything, particularly yourselves. And if you want to find Emerson, please check out Emerson Green on YouTube. He's there, and he's got his own podcast and all sorts. fantastic. Give him watch and a listen. He's always good value. In the meantime, toodle pips, everyone. Thanks for hanging out, and Emerson, we'll hang out again soon.